I am new to my position. I began my role on March the 1st of this year. I'll let our other two panelists introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eileen Coogan with Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, a couple of other Alleghenies out there, so hi, guys. We are a Catholic grant-making organization based in Palm Harbor, Florida, and we work to improve access to health care and create healthy communities in three sort of general regions of Florida.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Brewer. I'm the president and CEO of the Central Florida Foundation, which spans the 7 counties of Central Florida. And let me welcome all of you who are not from Orlando here. We'll play the role of Chamber of Commerce today. It's good to have you all in town.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Mark. And thank you, everyone, for being so attentive. I can't tell with the time change the last few hours if it's morning or afternoon, but my watch says it's still morning. How many of you have heard of the Florida Philanthropic Network? Wow. How many of you could recite our mission? I know. I had to learn it as well. So basically, our mission is to promote, develop, and advance philanthropy throughout Florida. Really thrilled that 2 of our great active members are sitting up here with me today. So we say that we are building philanthropy to build a better Florida. In essence, each word of our name, I think, is essential to our mission and what we are about. Obviously, we are a Florida network. We are based here as a regional network. Some networks or some regional associations of grant makers are multi-state. We're really pleased that our founding fathers and mothers envisioned for us to be Florida specific. And the other part, obviously, is philanthropy. Philanthropy comes, from the Greek, and it talks about the fact that we have a common love for humankind, technically mankind, but I'm going to bring it up to our age and to say humankind. We, care for one another. And the network is a beautiful piece of our name, I think, because it does bring grant makers together from all segments of philanthropy, whether it's a private foundation, a corporate grant maker, whether it's a community foundation, a faith-based foundation, a family foundation, just the full gamut of foundations are represented in our network. So our values guide our important work as FPN. This is one of my fond photos because in a prior life, I served as a nonprofit exec of an organization in Palm Beach County that was a grant maker for services, the Area Agency on Aging of Palm Beach and Treasure Coast. And when I was introduced back in February, this was hanging out with my Palm Beach County peeps for a few seconds. And really appreciate having that opportunity. So what we're about is how funders can collaborate on important issues, how we can come together to address an area of common impact, or how funders who have a particular interest or there's an emerging need within their community, within the region, or within the state to come together and to make an impact about that is critically important. The last year for which we have data, we know that foundations throughout Florida gave $1.7 billion in philanthropy dollars to benefit their communities. And that was an uptick from the prior year of 1.5 billion. So philanthropy is obviously very involved, very engaged, and is making a difference. And yet at the same time, when we compare this to the state budget and we realize the public resources, most of which, or a majority of which in Florida, are federal resources, that we basically, as philanthropy, could fund maybe a week's worth of operations. And I say that because, as we heard this morning in some of the framing statements, it's critically important that we are engaged in discussions about our public resources and the impact and the benefit that they have in a state like Florida. So Oh, all of a sudden I feel like I'm on. Was I on before? Oh, good. Now I can hear myself even, so whether that's good or bad, I don't know. So our most recent Giving in Florida report that was released in 2015 shows that education, health, and human services are the top funding priorities currently at Florida grant makers. The other thing I would like for you to know, and you can find out some of this information or visit our website at fpnetwork.org, that more than 85% of our members are a part of one of our affinity groups, which provide collaborative space for them as members and funders to connect and to work together to address key issues facing Floridians, whether that's education, as I said, health, homelessness, gender equity, and so many others. What we believe is that philanthropy needs and deserves a place and a seat at the table. Funders do not want to go into a community and impose solutions. That's not what grant makers are about. But they do want to serve as a collaborative thought leader to address a common challenge facing that community, that region, or the state. So what I would say is that advancing community impact requires a combination of several factors: trust, common interest, and respect for one another. And you'll be hearing more about those traits from our other two panelists today. And just a quick point here as we look at the recent hurricane facts of philanthropy and how philanthropy has arisen to respond to recent incidents. I think this slide speaks to the fact that we all must be engaged as Floridians. This data is about a month old, not quite a month old, and we're trying to get it more recent since Irma was after Harvey. But we see philanthropy's response in Harvey was about 3 times what we've had here in Florida as of this particular data point. So I see this as a challenge as well as an opportunity. So Eileen, I think we will now turn to you, and we will have time at the end for questions and for further collaboration. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. How's that, right distance from the mic? Okay. So I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit, so you got to pay attention. It's going to keep you all awake, right, as you wait for my stomach is telling me it's lunchtime. I don't know if it's really breakfast time or lunchtime or what, but I want to give a couple of examples, talk a little bit about some examples of civic engagement in community, among partners, and from funders, and then talk about a couple of trends that are, I think, impacting how we engage in community. So at the end, I'll kind of come back to the disaster piece too. So maybe there'll be a few threads there. So I wanted to start talking. One of the things we were asked to think about was collective impact, and I don't like that word. I really never use the phrase. I never use it. I feel like it's too many people have different definitions for what collective impact is. It means many different things to different people, and true collective impact is actually pretty rare. It really requires having active partners from every possible sector, all having a common agenda, having common measures, good communication, mutually reinforcing activities, and a backbone organization. And most of the time when we have engaged collaborations and partnerships in community, they don't have all of those things. It doesn't mean they're not good. And so I wanted to talk about a couple of three different examples. They all happen to be funded in part or were funded originally by Allegheny. And so I know a little bit more about them than some others. Probably everybody in this room can point to examples in your own communities that demonstrate some of these same partnership models. So the first one is called Going Overtown. It's the newest on my little list. It's a new online platform that seeks to engage the Overtown Miami community and its stakeholders in conversation, in action, creating pride in the community, finding ways to get together physically beyond the online community, and ultimately creating a voice for the community. So it's a really exciting opportunity for using a social media platform or an online platform to engage people. in what is typically a pretty disenfranchised, marginalized community. The second one is, second shout out to Miami, is a social justice table. And it looks like there's some people here that are involved with the social justice table in Miami. Yay. So, hi, Daniela. So this is a multi-sector, mostly nonprofit, but multi-sector network of organizations. They all have different missions, different constituents, but each one has a focus on social justice in some way. And they came together in 2014, recognizing that if they came together to focus on sort of the broad platform of social justice, it would not only help each of them individually to achieve their goals and impact, but also collectively would make a bigger difference for the greater community. And so since 2014, they've convened multiple workshops and community gatherings. They completed this really fascinating power structure analysis, which they'd probably be happy to share with you. It's really an interesting way to think about how do you make change happen in a community by understanding where the power is. It's not always where you think it is. And then the final example I have is probably the one that's closest to being a true community impact model, and it's called the 2020 Plan. It's in South St. Petersburg, and one thing that they have is a very, very clear and specific goal, which is to reduce poverty in South St. Pete by the 2020 census. So it was a lot of people came together with this common goal in mind. It incubated in the local urban league, and then ultimately, fairly quickly, was able to become its own organization, has an executive director, has, I think, 11 different collective impact strategies and initiatives that they're working on. So another just really a quick, I hope, example of a good partnership that's really trying to engage the community. And then I want to give a couple shout outs to Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, and this is the next slide, Bob. So funders around the country are kind of trying to get in touch with this collective impact model or engaging in the community model. And so really looking to build capacity and address community priorities in a different way than our traditional funding has been. And so I kind of call it a quasi-collective impact approach. And Allegheny, starting in 2014, also got involved in this. So about half of our $6 million a year that we invest in communities, about half of that goes into what we call the Common Good Initiative. We're working in 3 communities in Florida: Overtown, Miami, which is why I know the Overtown examples, Lincoln Park, which is in Fort Pierce, St. Lucie County, and Waimama, which is in rural Hillsborough County. And we're working with residents and stakeholders in those communities to really drive change and try to foster good in ways that will create healthier, safer, more connected communities where everyone thrives. So it's a very different model for us, and really starting with community and building up and trying to engage a lot of folks in the community. We also know, though, that in order to sustain any investments and change that happens in the community, we need to have a stronger capacity, both in organizations and individuals. And so this year, we just launched, we had the first meeting of the Fellowship for the Common Good, where we're bringing together residents from each of the community who either are or have the potential to be leaders, and taking them through a year-long program that's really designed for them to be able to take action to advance their community. So it's a really exciting, I think, new project. There's some really colorful, pretty brochures on your table. We put about 4 on each table. Anyone who's interested, feel free to take them. We have more if you like. So I'm going to sort of jump around to a couple of trends now, and then I'll give it over to Mark, which really relate to how social media and the World Wide Web has changed engagement. I started out in the early to mid 80s in Boston as a volunteer for Project Bread, the Walk for Hunger. The walk started in 1969, and when I was there in the mid 80s, it still only had a few thousand people. Towards the end of the 1980s, we reached our first $1 million walk. That $1 million was achieved by people taking pieces of paper around to friends and having them write down how much they were going to sponsor, and then hand over cash or write checks. And that $1 million came into the office by U.S. mail in big fat envelopes of dirty cash and checks. And we sat in a back room counting the money. That's how I learned how to use an adding machine. And so I think about the difference now in how the online platforms of fundraising for sponsorship type events, walks and runs and those sort of things, what a difference that is. And then thinking about two fairly new but amazingly successful things. GoFundMe, which is less than a decade old, it started in 2010, huge social fundraising platform. They've raised over $4 billion, have more than 40 million donors. Most people use GoFundMe to raise money for themselves, their families, their friends. I was heard on the radio as I was driving here this morning about a young person who went to college, got all scholarships to get to college, but forgot about the money needed for housing. And so a high school teacher started a GoFundMe campaign, and in 10 days they raised enough money for the kids' housing. So lots of different things that people can really connect quickly with and impact quickly through that. And then there's Giving Tuesday and other give days that happen locally. Stay tuned, because I think November 28th is the next big Giving Tuesday event. So just another way that people are using online to really drive contributions and philanthropic engagement. Another phenomenon that really took off this year is, I think, termed acti-giving. You could probably also say acti-doing. It's when you have an activist response to something and decide to give or volunteer as a result. So Volunteer Match had a single-day record of inquiries 2 days after the election. Then they broke their own record 4 days after the inauguration. People really feeling they need to respond to something that they see in their world and want to find some way to take control over the world. And so by volunteering and by donating, huge surge also. I'm sure people heard in giving right after the elections and right after the inauguration. Planned Parenthood received 80,000 donations in the 3 days after the election. The ACLU had 24 million separate online donations over just a single weekend. So that surge in people wanting to engage based on what they see happening in the world, and that connects to the disaster piece also. The challenge is for organizations and individuals to sustain that, and that's really the big unanswered question at this point. I want to just take one more minute to talk about the sort of downside of social media, and that is that social media doesn't equitably distribute information or democratically spread support. There's this power law, there's big winners, and that snowballs, and then there's lots and lots and lots of smaller players. And philanthropy kind of gets caught up in that as well, where I'm sure you've seen the online contests that reward organizations that get the most likes and give them to get a grant. In September, both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands were devastated by 2 enormous hurricanes. I told you I was going to get back to disaster. So Puerto Rico has a much larger population, 3.4 million to 110,000, but it gets so much more media attention than the U.S. Virgin Islands, even though the situation is just as bad. In St. Croix and St. John, St. Thomas, the percent of people that have electricity is less than the percent of people in Puerto Rico. But almost no attention to that. We were, Aaron can tell you, we were planning to give a grant, or did give a grant for $10,000 to a national organization that's working in those two, in the islands. And we were going to give it mostly to Puerto Rico. And they said, could you please designate it to the U.S. Virgin Islands, because they're getting nothing. So, and that has a lot to do with the attention in the media, that's where people direct their funds, where they go. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'm kind of just going to keep going and leave no time for Mark. Sorry.
It's all right, Eileen.
What else can we talk about?
I want to put some context for you around a couple of things that we throw around a lot in civics. The framework, for instance, for today, as we talk about philanthropy and volunteering, and then we think about how that connects to civics. Philanthropy has really become a generic term over the last 20 years. And I think it's important that every once in a while you just kind of break it down to identify how philanthropy really plays out. So first of all, we like to talk about nonprofits, but you shouldn't call them that. They're part of a sector called the independent sector, which economists know is the kind of creative and innovative way that we do things in America that draws capital from the other two sectors in order to drive social change. And so if you think about that for a minute, that's 501c1s through 501c25s. That's a lot of nonprofits. There are 17,000 of them just in the metropolitan area you're sitting in right now. And collectively, they generate about $4.8 billion a year in contributions. They're the third largest employer in the region. And so you're now looking at a part of the economy that the average person on the street never sees, nor do they understand. And so everybody who ever walked in a walk or gave some money to United Way thinks of themselves as participating in philanthropy. The reality is that market space is really broken up into three kind of distinct and different structures. The first one I'll refer to as retail philanthropy, and that's the act of giving. That's someone asks and you give. There's a campaign, you make a contribution. Doesn't matter how much you give, the fact that you are reactively contributing to something someone has made you aware of or asked you for is part of democracy from the beginning. It's part of what makes America, America. But the vast majority of people, when they think about philanthropy, look only at that market segment, and they think that reflects philanthropy in America. The next segment happens to people, all of us, at some time in our lives. If we are givers, if we are donors, we reach a point in our lives where we've given enough times, may not be money, it just may be that we've given enough times, that now we start to ask some complicated questions. Like, if we've been giving to find a cure for this disease for 25 years, how come there isn't one? If we're giving to homelessness, how come homelessness is getting worse? If we're giving to all kinds of issues that we think are critical and at crisis mode, how come nothing's getting fixed in this process? Retail philanthropy is primarily built to sustain processes that we hope and believe will change the world. But philanthropists in nature are not people who give a lot of money. They're people who give money specifically around performance measures to change something. And so at whatever point in our lives we come to that conclusion that lots of people are asking and I'm giving every time someone asks, and now instead of doing that, I'm going to start focusing my limited charitable capital. And I love that phrase. That, by the way, is a quote from Bill Gates' best friend, Warren Buffett, who just last year said, hey, we have limited charitable capital. Well, if he has limited charitable capital, I think the rest of us have next to couch change to work with. And so this limited charitable capital focused in a way that we can try to find solutions to things is what philanthropy is really all about. Now, there's a dark side to philanthropy too, and it's fair in a roundtable like this that we at least recognize and understand it. On the far right, there's the Kochs and 14 other high net worth conservative families. And on the left, there's George Soros and 10 other high net worth, highly liberal families who put billions of dollars into changing the way America thinks by giving money to nonprofits to seed strategies and communication and language across America to make us think differently. In last year's election, if you're just not thinking about that darkest of money, and that is some pretty dark money when you look at what they've done and what they've accomplished by giving to nonprofits whose primary focus is to change discussion. But if you just look at Florida in the last election in 2016, almost $1 billion of philanthropy left what you and I might think of as philanthropy: healthcare, education, arts and culture, human services, the faith-based community. Almost $1 billion left that part of philanthropy to move to support political candidates. It happens in every election. Because if you and I care about, pick something, education, I could either make contributions to a bunch of education nonprofits and public schools and private schools, or I could get somebody with an education policy elected who could change the whole thing with a bigger pot of money, as Bob defined earlier. That would be the government's money. And so if you start thinking about philanthropy as really capital that drives primary social change, then you start to think about what are the new civics of America where you have to bring people's civic engagement and money together, and it's just what Eileen defined. It is collective impact. That is the new architecture for civic engagement around philanthropy. And so her examples are perfect examples of how you bring communities together. And as she said, unless you've read the Stanford documents and you're an academic and you love all that stuff, the reality is that good collective impact happens every day, not in its full intent, but in pieces of it. And it begins really with three things. The first is, can you get enough data to actually define what it is you're trying to change? So if you were going to invest in a source problem, where would you find the source problem instead of spreading your money against all the crisis that's out there that you might be able to solve? That's what philanthropy is about. So two examples from the Central Florida Foundation that really bring this together and mimic in many ways what Eileen and her teams are doing. First of all, 28 months ago in this community, we had a real homeless problem here, and the community didn't know it because they didn't know anything about homelessness. They thought homelessness was the guy on the side of the street with a cardboard sign. They didn't realize that that guy could be an entrepreneur, or he could be homeless, or he could be homeless and an entrepreneur, but they didn't know where he came from or who he was or what his life situation was. After collecting a lot of data among a bunch of organizations who got together and agreed to create a scorecard with measures, not talking about how we were going to end homelessness, but how the measures of ending homelessness would look, and then identifying 10 cities across America whose data looked better than ours. In other words, who's doing it better than we are, and can we then build a gap between what we're doing that's evidence-based, what other people are doing that's evidence-based. Let's get that gap, and let's take that to the marketplace. And the marketplace is all three sectors. It's the public sector, who has the deepest pockets. It's the private sector, who's busy creating wealth, but may have impact on this event. And it's the independent sector, who are primarily service providers in this process. I'm proud to tell you, in the short story, 28 months later, we have housed more than 800 of this community's most vulnerable chronically homeless people, and they remained housed. We've reduced the cost of caring for those people from $31,500 a year when they're left on the street to a little over $12,000 a year when they're housed with services surrounding them. And we've reduced the cost of emergency room care in this community by taking those people out of emergency rooms and giving them literally preventative care before they end up in a crisis where they need the help. In the world that we live in today, it's really about trying to identify, can we get to a source problem, then can we get champions from the public sector? And a champion, I'll just tell you, a champion's a mayor, right? There are lots of elected officials, and I love them all, but mayors hold a lot of power. And if you have a mayor who's a champion about something that's going on in your community, you'll not only draw resources and attention, you'll get the private sector's attention, and you'll get lots of people around a table who want to talk about it because the mayor's interested in it. If your mayor doesn't mention it or isn't interested in it, chances are it'll end up on the pile of things that are probably important but no one's paying attention to. You have to have private sector champions from the business community because they drive accountability and performance measures. And they ask the question, when is this getting done and who owns the job? And how fast are we moving? And is this a process or are we actually building performance? And then you have to have an independent sector that's innovative and creative, and the three sectors together, pulling investment to something, can solve just about any problem. Just last week, we finalized a project we've been working on for a year. We had 35 people around a table every month for a year. We had real estate developers, we had jurisdictional folks, we had elected officials, we had nonprofits focusing on housing and other issues, and this group was looking at what would be a source problem solution that would drive us forward against Florida's affordable housing problem. And the answer was a regional community land trust where jurisdictions can place real estate, where donors can give real estate, where we then can remove dirt from the transactions of both rent and purchase, and we can actually build and develop multifamily pieces on real estate that doesn't have to be included in the price of the deal. That makes everything more affordable, and it keeps it affordable forever. No body, no individual, no institution could have led that discussion. We convened it at the Central Florida Foundation, but those folks came around that table because the room was trusted. It was a place where we recognized that things weren't going to be pretty all the time and that things might not even work out at the end, but we were willing to work through till we came to a solution. And now we'll actually operationalize this, systemize it. So the point I want to make to you is that philanthropy at its best is the ability to engage people to give to the retail market when they can. We were talking a while ago about the fact that if you just look at national numbers, it's kind of frightening. In the last 20 years, the percentage of people who make less than $100,000 a year and give anything to charity has dropped from about 43% to a little less than 25%. And the number of people who make more than $200,000 a year has risen to 75%. So one of the things we're not doing well is we're not engaging people. Because philanthropy, whether it's big Bill Gates philanthropy or it's little you and me writing a check for $250, that philanthropy begins with engagement. And what this sector did, the independent sector did in the late 1800s so successfully was it engaged people around tables to mostly have civic and political discussions. And everybody around those tables put a little money out of their wallet on the table before they left the meeting to help push the process forward. Today, we don't have any push for the process because the people that are literally emerging as thinking civic leaders and as philanthropists aren't giving as much as they used to because they don't see any reason to. They can't figure out why it matters. And the people giving the most money, those families on both the far left and the far right, they are changing the course of American politics with money you don't even see every day. We have work to do, and I think in this room, the ability to get all of us together to have these kinds of discussions and to see this thread that runs through volunteerism, into philanthropy, and then over into actual civic engagement is the piece that makes all of this work. So I love this discussion, and I love the fact that we're in the room having it, and thanks for the opportunity, Bob.
So Bob, we'll see if there's any questions for the panelists.
Thank you all so much, all three of you. I'm Jack Levine with Four Generations Institute, and I have a question about the assumption, and I assume there's some fact, that a proportion of Floridians' giving goes back to where they came from. That's always kind of assumed that they've lived a life of either faith-based or university-based or community-based, and they've come here and there's no sense of place here, so the money goes back there with their maybe eventual remains. So what is that fact, if you know it, but more than important about that, what are we doing about it?
I think I would start to answer that question by turning it just a little bit, Jack, back to an assumption that's been made for the last 50 years, and that is we all have a responsibility to give back where we live. And I think what you'll find if you look at the current literature is that not everybody actually believes that. So if I was born and raised somewhere where I actually have a connection, and I come here and I don't have any engagement, giving back there isn't me preferring where I came from over where I am. It's just the fact that there's a marketplace here that hasn't been engaged in that process. I don't know if you know this, the philanthropy research that's done around the Chronicle of Philanthropy recently noted in each city and state, you can go online and look it up, you can look at how much money is given and what the national median is, and then they give you what's left on the table, what's lost based on what people are giving. And in Florida, we could raise from the people who give now another $150 million a year if only the people in Florida gave at the same rate as people do on the median in America. So this is engagement at the very lowest level. It's not a preference, it's about whether or not you get it. And as I tend to joke with people, until we do all the cancer research downtown in our hometowns, and everybody goes to the university that we go to, there's going to be a lot of philanthropy leave town wherever you live, because that's just the nature of how people think about where they come from and what they do.
Hello, my name's Dawn. I'm the political director for the Student Public Interest Research Groups. We're a national nonprofit that's totally run and funded by college students. So I have the distinction of saying, yeah, college students tell me what to do and they could fire me at any point in time. So we have 300,000 dues-paying college student members across the country, and we just got started thinking about grant fundraising, so we're about 5% grant funded right now. And I started my position 4 months ago, and the first thing I thought is like, okay, we can get this money, but how do we actually sustain ourselves after this grant? So how do y'all think about funding nonprofits and making sure that they can self-sustain from their communities after your initial investment?
Oh, she asked a sustainability question. That's my other soapbox. I think it is unfair of us as funders, as community, to expect nonprofit organizations, the independent sector, to be self-sustaining. I think it requires always the community to be a part of that and build that. So I think it's one of the things that we as foundations create part of the problem by saying we're only going to fund something, for 3 years, and then you're on your own. Be sustainable, and that's not possible. So there are ways. You're a membership organization. You have dues-paying members, so that provides a base. Which I think is a great start, and lots of organizations in the independent sector can do that or have some kind of social enterprise. But I think in the way our society currently operates, we will always need philanthropic support from organizations like the funders, the Central Florida Foundation and Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, as well as from community. That's my soapbox.
Yeah, and I would just give you one additional piece there. You should look for alternative revenue streams because you have a center of knowledge that may also be saleable to other folks. You know things. You have the ability to gather data from your members that might be more interesting than you think to other people who are trying to gauge what's the next generation of politically and civically engaged people thinking and where are they going. Those are things to do. I agree with Eileen about sustainability. There are some things that cannot be sustained. But what we're missing and what is kind of new on the horizon is the ability for investors, donors, and others to get enough data to make a decision, right? So if our organization is doing something phenomenal and it's got a measure connected to it and you can see it, and we have no other revenue sources, you would want to invest in it. If, however, we're process-driven and doing lots of good work, but we can't actually articulate what we're changing or whose lives we've impacted, then there might not be a market for what we're doing, and that can be a problem.
Let me just add one quick comment to that, Mark, to maybe to belabor your comment just a second, but I also would suggest that you look for alignment with other nonprofits that are similar to yourself. We've got great organizations here in Florida. The Florida Nonprofit Alliance is one. I think Sabine will be here if she's not here. So, check her out and find them as a resource. I also think the Florida Society of Association Executives is another great group because, Mark, to your point, membership associations need to diversify your base, and you don't want more than 50% as your goal as a best practice. You don't want more than 50% of your revenue coming from membership dues. Right. So those are my additional insights.
Good morning. Great leadership panel. All of you really at the forefront of philanthropy, not just being service, but also being about changing public policy. So I wanted to ask you to address that. That is a challenge, I know, for philanthropy and for nonprofits to know how much they can engage and how to engage in public policy advocacy. I know you all have navigated those tricky waters. Just to underscore, yes, nonprofits can engage in public policy advocacy, but there's a lot of fear around it, lack of understanding, and philanthropy might even be more constrained. So I'd be interested to know how you're engaging in it and what you could recommend to others.
All right.
I'll start that one.
Start? Yeah.
I think it's a great question, and we are really looking at that at FPN right now in terms of policy because there is such a concern about lobbying. And let me go ahead and say that in my prior position, I was a registered lobbyist. So, but prior to that position, I always was engaged as an advocate because the Older Americans Act, our primary funder, required that of us. And Jeff, I've been a AARP member since I was age 21. I just didn't tell AARP my age. I just left that
Trying to get
off
something for
because
free, huh?
I just thought this is such a great organization to engage with. But
Could I just add one tiny thing? I forgot to mention that we don't know each other so well. I'm a county commissioner in Miami-Dade County, Daniela Living Cava, and I also was a registered lobbyist for many years.
yeah, I remember from this morning, Danielle. So yeah, thank you for that reminder. But let me just say that we are really looking at how policy works in philanthropy at FPN, and we're looking strategically as one of our 5 pillars of our new refreshed plan to address this issue. I think it's really critically important in terms of philanthropy, what philanthropy can do, and what gets into that lobbying space, so that folks can be more informed about how you can be involved and to educate. Also, once you leave the workplace, what you can do as individuals in terms of engagement in the public process, I think is also, critically important. I think that we've got a lot of issues in front of us. At the federal level, there's efforts to weaken the Johnson Amendment, which addresses how nonprofits can engage, in political work, to the charitable deduction that you mentioned this morning. I think that that's another critical part. If the charitable deduction is reduced, or if there's not like a below the line deduction for taxpayers who are not itemized. And if we go from 35% of the population to 5% who itemize, which is what tax reform is indicating to us, what is the impact on philanthropy? I mean, should that be our motivation as givers? Is it our motivation as givers? Well, obviously for some, we believe that it will impact if that provision is not addressed within Congress. So I think we've got to continue to monitor that. The other piece that really concerns me about the charitable deduction is that if we lose the charitable deduction, we also lose data, because that's where all the information that we really get in terms of how consumers or how taxpayers are making a difference, that's where the data comes from. And my fear is that we will not miss that data for several years, because it's always a little bit dated. You always go back a year or two in terms of, what we can get out of the IRS, what researchers, academia can get out of it. So we won't miss it for a couple of years, and all of a sudden we'll create a vacuum and we'll be thinking, how do we solve this crisis? So I think it is really important that we address that, and we'll continue to have that dialogue with you and with others.
Daniela, can I take that from the other side? Bob's talking about advocacy around the sector and specifically around how the sector operates. Can I just say that I believe there is a new context for engaging in public policy for independent sector businesses and nonprofits. Where in the old days, advocacy was really just about money. It was really about, in fact, most of nonprofit sector advocacy was nothing more than holding or gaining budget at some level or another around some element that we thought nobody knew was as important as it actually is. But in the new world, what's happening is the sector actually has enough strength and history to help write policy that elected officials are turning to the sector. I don't want to be disrespectful of the younger folks in the room, but when you get to the state level and the federal level, if young staff members are writing all the policy documents by looking up stuff online to figure out who's doing what in some ways, at some point, they should be calling people in the sector who are actually doing this work to help sculpt policy that actually works. It isn't so much about the funding as it is about getting policy that works and involves more than one sector. And so I think what you're going to see over the next few years is more nonprofits actively involved in having policy discussions with elected officials, local, state, and federal. And I think you're going to find now some solutions and some data from those solutions being presented to elected officials to say, we kind of know what works and what doesn't work, and you can go off down another path if you want to, and we'll work with you as best we can, but why don't you try something that actually has a track record of working in more than one place? As we get more data, we'll be better at that.
Great. Thanks, Bob, for the unsolicited endorsement that's totally unrelated to the drink I'll buy you at the bar later. Mark talked about metrics, and I guess I'm suddenly more focused on what the Florida Civic Advance measures. What would you suggest this organization, this collaboration, should focus on if we want to improve the breadth, depth, impact of philanthropy in Florida? What's the indicator on the Florida Civic Health sheet we have is a percentage of people who give at least $25, and I don't know if that includes GoFundMe donations or not, but is that even the right measure? What should be the right measure?
Yeah, I absolutely believe the measure is engagement and money. It's not just money. Because if what you're trying to do is get everybody to give because you think that makes them more civically engaged, it actually doesn't. It may make them feel better. But the reality is retail fundraising is a business in and of itself. It's where I'm holding a walk that's better than her walk on the same day, and I can get you to come to mine because my T-shirt's better. We did some research at the foundation and identified, it's been almost 7 years ago now, but we found that of the 5,000 kind of primary high-level impact dinners and fundraising events, about 7,500 people in the region participated in all of those. And if you know anything about economics, that's called a circular economic puzzle. That's where I buy the table from you because you asked me, and then later you buy a table from me because you're repaying me, and then I buy one from her, and then she buys one from me. And so what's happening here is measuring down at the $25 level, I'd rather measure how many people in certain economic spaces are giving consistently, and they're engaged in the things they're giving to. It's not just about collecting a few dollars. It's about engagement first, followed by investment. Without that ratio, you can raise a lot of money once. I could run around, dump water on everybody's heads, and we get a lot of money once. But once that's over, there's no more money.
Okay, thank you, panel, for wonderful stimulating talk.